For us at Steps, travel isn't simply about places and destinations. It's about people and getting to know people better, whether through unplanned, sometimes unconditional moments that create connections. The trust in strangers is the very essence of travel. The kindness of strangers, a reaffirmation that on the whole we are good. And over our series of interviews with broadcasters, with travellers, writers, photographers and explorers, we aim to explore further these benefits of travel, the fact that it can help sort of break down barriers and change perceptions and indeed prejudice. And this afternoon I'm delighted to be joined by Tharik Hussain. Tharik is an award-winning author. He's a writer, he's a travel journalist, and he specialises in Muslim culture and heritage. So I'm just now going to try and get Tharik on board. Here we are.
How are we doing there? You all right?
Hey, well, great to have you on board. So thank you very much for joining us today, and not least to talk about your book, Minarets in the Mountains, a journey into Muslim Europe. It's a book that's been so fantastically received. It won the British Guild of Travel Writers Adele Evans Award for the best travel narrative. It was shortlisted for the Stanford Book of the Year and also the Baylor Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. It's also, I think, the Washington Post, New Statesman, Times Literary Supplement, a series of fantastic reviews. And I myself had the pleasure of reading it this summer. And I very much, I loved the book, and I loved its journey. I loved where you took us as readers. Do you want to let us know, how did it all come about? How did the concept itself come about?
There's a short answer and a long answer, Justin. I don't know how much time we have, but I'll try and find something in the middle. So essentially, it's the culmination of almost 2 decades of travel. And it was a kind of, it's just been part of a personal journey to try and better understand what I believe to be my personal Islamic heritage across the Western Hemisphere, which increasingly with my journeys, I began to realize was very poorly, if at all, represented. And when it was being represented, as you've discovered in the book, I often found it was being represented in a very negative way, in a way that was quite problematic for me as a Muslim, but also I could see the way in which it had affected how the Western world continues to look at Muslims, Muslim culture, and this idea that somehow it is foreign and something separate from Europe. So it was the coming together of all of this, and this was one of many journeys I had done at this point. But this particular one felt like it had the makings of a book from the minute we started, going on it as a family. And and I was very fortunate that, of course, there was interest from publishers, and and that's how it came about.
Great. And so there's your book there.
Sorry, I'm holding the German one.
Those listening who've not yet read it. Where did the journey take you? Where did you start? Where did you go to? Where did you?
So I really wanted to travel in this particular region known as the Western Balkans for a number of reasons. The most obvious is the fact, it's alluded to in the title. I considered this to be a living Muslim Europe. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, essentially, I visited 3 countries, starting in Sarajevo, and did a kind of, loosely speaking, a circular route through 6 countries. And 3 of those countries are, quote unquote, in my opinion, European Muslim countries. When we look at the population breakdown, in that Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, and Kosovo all have Muslim majority populations. So in the same way my country of birth, Bangladesh, is considered a Muslim country because of the sheer number of Muslims living there, not necessarily because of the constitution or anything else. For me, it was absolutely ridiculous that, there were 3 Muslim countries sitting here in Europe, and yet every time I spoke to people about Muslim culture being a normalized part of the European landscape, it was as though I was, speaking complete nonsense. And so we went from Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We then also ventured into Serbia. From Serbia, we went into Kosovo, back to Serbia. Then we went to North Macedonia, Albania, Montenegro, back to Sarajevo in Bosnia. So back to Bosnia. And as well as the fact that 3 of these countries are, are what I consider to be Muslim countries in Europe, the other countries in this region also had what I call indigenous European Muslim communities living within them. In other words, Serbian Muslims, North Macedonian Muslims, Montenegrin Muslims. And for me, to go and explore these areas and put before people in a normalized way this heritage, this history, show the beauty of it, highlight the fact that it's often neglected or overlooked when you have a non-Muslim set of lens traveling through these regions. That was very important for me, and I feel like the success of the book kind of vindicates that position to sort of say, actually, if a Muslim is traveling through this area, what do they see? And they actually see a very Muslim Europe.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier on that you were traveling with your family, and at the time your girls were 12 and 14. So I presume you had to plan a certain amount before, or was there a bit of sort of free rein, or did you have to stick pretty much the
No, we consciously kept it relatively loose. Of course, I intended to travel through certain places because of the research I'd done, and the fact that I was following a certain Ottoman traveler, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later. But on the whole, we're a family that have been traveling since they were both literally in the womb. So we've got them quite used to the idea that, they might fall asleep in the car and wake up in another country, and they're very flexible like that. That's not to say that, of course, we didn't plan moments and venues and spaces to visit spaces and venues that were specifically for their benefit, because we had been traveling as a family for a long time. We had done big trips like this prior, and so we were experienced enough to know that sometimes it's got to be about them. And it often was, but that's not necessarily maybe the bits that ended up in the book, because of course in the book I was trying to tell a particular narrative.
And I remember that one of your daughters was reading Zlati's, I don't know if I pronounced it right, Zlati's diary, which is a young child's view of, I think she was a Bosnian Muslim, of her view of Sarajevo. Did you do lots of reading beforehand, or were you one person who sort of, I want to go there sort of an open mind and read afterwards rather than
I'm a journalist by profession. I love history and heritage, so I do a fair amount of reading to be guided on the journey, because of course what I don't want to do is sometimes come back and find that I've missed something that was literally around the corner, which does happen for completely different reasons. But I did do a whole heap of reading. I obviously read a lot of the Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi's narratives before I headed out there. But the fact that my daughter and I was reading this diary was part and parcel of one of the ways in which we as a family always try to engage with the kind of, for want of a better phrase, the native culture and the native community. We always try to encourage our children to sort of engage with it, be it through a book or other forms of media that they're more comfortable with, so that they come away with more than just some kind of holiday experience.
So I love that. I love it. You mentioned Çelebi earlier on, and you part of the book is seeing it through his eyes, albeit many hundreds of years ago when he was traveling, but also through the eyes of your family a little bit. And so to what extent was it a sense of discovery for them as well? I know, as you said, that you couldn't include everything that you did with your children or family in the book itself, but it was as much a sense of discovery for them and
no, absolutely. In fact, they ended up becoming a very important part of the book for a number of reasons. One, I'm very privileged that I'm able to go off and take my children and my family to explore this heritage, which is otherwise almost inaccessible in the popular domain. which is the reason, Justin, I wrote the book, obviously, in the hope that other people can also have access to this, because they may not necessarily be in the privileged position that I was in to be able to take my children to go off and see this. But this is their heritage. You know, this is my wife's heritage, this is my children's heritage. We are European Muslims. You know, I have a mixed family with cultural backgrounds that come from not just South Asia, where I'm from, but also from the UK itself, from Europe itself. And so this was, for me, it was super important that they were with me when I'm off and exploring these spaces and these places, not necessarily to drag them around and see every kind of ruin that I find, or walk into every mosque, because of course that doesn't work with young people either. But I wanted them to be there so that whether they reflect on it straight away or whether they reflect on it in years to come, you know, they're able to embrace this heritage as their own. And of course, the other thing that you've highlighted is that they also offered a wonderful set of lens that I don't have. You know, they're two girls. My wife is, you know, a convert to the faith. These are completely different lens to my own. So I don't see the world the way they do. And so, with their permission, when I wrote them into the book, and when I tried to speak for them in the book, which was not easy, I can tell you, you know, that also offered a set of lens that I don't think we often see within travel literature. The idea of you know, your family being a part of the journey is not the norm. So these were also things that I had to think carefully about. But they again are another set of Muslim lens, just in the same way Evliya Çelebi was a pair of Muslim lens looking at this particular space. And Çelebi was super important, not just because it was fun to go back in time and you know, wander alongside a historical traveler. He was important because he was actually traveling through this region just at the height of the Ottoman Empire. So in other words, he was traveling through this region when it was the most Muslim it's ever been. And so what that allowed me to do is it allowed me to compare and contrast what I was seeing with what he was seeing. And then I was able to talk about what had been eradicated in ways that I hadn't come across myself before. You know, there are many, of course, there's tons of literature, tons of documentary, tons of media out there that will tell you about the systematic eradication of various ethnicities and various ethnic cultures across the Balkans during the Balkan Wars. But actually, by going way back to the 17th century, I was able to see when that really began, when that process began. And I would be turning up in places that I would never have guessed were once thriving Muslim towns and cities, had it not been for the window that Evliya Çelebi offered.
I think that's very interesting, and what you were saying about sort of the past and present and sort of comparing the two. And you talk about the Ottoman Empire, because what struck me in reading your book, and I also recently have traveled around that area, was it's not the right word, but almost the pluralistic nature of the Ottoman Empire, and the fact that it was majority Muslim. There was still Orthodox, there was still Catholic churches. And did you got a sense of that yourself when you were traveling?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You certainly get a sense of that, having historically been the case, of course. You know, I remember arriving in Sarajevo, you know, as excited as a child in a sweet shop because of the fact that I was finally going to the Jerusalem of Europe, as it had been dubbed, because of course it was famously where Jews, Christians and Muslims lived side by side. Now we all sadly know what happened to the Jewish community there, but there is still a large Christian community in the city, and the city is very proud of that. But the other interesting thing was, of course, when I arrived there super excited, as I said, I then opened Evliya Çelebi's book, and you know, he was speaking in a very kind of matter-of-fact, blasé way about this, because for him, all of the territories that he was traveling through, which were Ottoman territories at the time, had the same policy. You know, where communities of other denominations, be it Christian or Jewish, had their own little segments and their own little neighborhoods, and were allowed to live there under the millet system. And so to come across the remnants of that, but also to kind of sense that in the spirit of the people who know that this is their heritage was really, really beautiful. And I really felt this in Sarajevo when I would speak to the people who were there, much more than maybe most other places, where they really wanted to recapture that. They wanted that to be the future as well as what had been the past. And I think when you live in a place where you have that historic heritage to stand upon, then it's a lot easier to say this is what we want to go back to. And Sarajevo wasn't the only place, as I pointed out. You know, I turned up in places like Novi Pazar where this had been the case in the past, and then I turned up in other places like Niš in Serbia where this had been the case, and across this region, and across, of course, as many people know, most of the Ottoman territories.
So, and reading the book, and I studied history at university, I know a little bit about the era and the period, and certainly the Ottomans. And I don't know, history at school, we just learn about a certain king and his 6 wives, and we're sort of very parochial in that sense. To what extent do you feel that the Islamic contribution to Europe is not talked about enough, and why do you think that
again, there's a long and a short answer, Justin, and I imagine we're doing something on social media, so we'll keep it short. The truth of the matter is, history in the West was written by the winners. And when we look at historically at the kind of colossal battle that took place throughout the medieval period, it was, quote unquote, Islam versus Christianity. And for want of a better phrase, Christianity won. You know, and that's who ended up writing the history. And inevitably, what then happens is you have a very skewed version of that history. But what then happens later on is those that came later who considered themselves to be more objective scholars, or even considered themselves to be objective scholars, they were standing on the shoulders of this previous literature and relying on the shoulder of this previous literature, and whether it was consciously or unconsciously, they inherited a lot of that bias. So unfortunately, it continues in the writing right up to the modern period, because often when we're at university, as you pointed out, when we're at schools, you know, we're relying on the literature that has come and gone. You know, and that literature has largely been written, as I said, by those who considered Islam to be something foreign, alien, and not of Europe. And yet, of course, as I point out in my book, Islam arrived in Europe almost the minute it arrived into this world, shall we say. And you know, just for the listeners, I want to point out, you know, the reverse is true of a place of the Middle Eastern region, for example, where again you could say, well, who won? Well, the Muslims won. And this is why when I'm out, say, for example, working on a guidebook in Saudi Arabia, as I have done recently for Lonely Planet, I struggle to find the Christian heritage in these spaces, the Jewish heritage in these spaces. I struggle to find it in the literature, because again, of course, this is what's happening. Yeah, you know, the literary heritage of these spaces were written from the perspective of the winners.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think your book is so key, and I think it's an important one in trying to sort of redress that history. In terms of the present, I mentioned in my intro sort of the kindness of strangers. What did you feel sort of in the present day? Who did you meet? What sort of acts of kindness?
You know, I'm very lucky. I almost rely on the kindness of strangers often, because I do stupid things and end up lost and confused, as most travelers do. And inevitably, sometimes
you need a good tour operator next time. Steps Travel can help you out.
And inevitably, they end up becoming some of our most cherished moments and experiences. And in this on this particular journey, the most powerful moments were actually connected to in my opinion, a lost Muslim piece of heritage, which is where you show kindness to a traveler. You know, this idea of really.
Very much
and to be honest, you know, I don't want to claim that this is somehow an exclusively Islamic thing. We know that it predates Islam, the idea of, you know, honoring and caring for the traveler for at least 3 days and 3 nights. And this is something that clearly Muslim culture adopted in a big way, and of course was reinforced by the Prophet himself, who spoke about how important it was to look after travelers, and who would speak about, of course, if a traveler prays for you, how that is accepted so easily by God. And so what happened is, for example, we found ourselves in one particular situation in the town of Novi Pazar in the southwest of Serbia, where we turned up and you know, first of all, by the way, Justin, I had absolutely no idea that there were entirely Muslim towns in Serbia. This was the first shock. You know, we turn up in this town. We're sitting in the middle of town. We're eating pizza, and we're about to order some pizza, and we're looking at this menu, and it says sausage on the pizza. And of course, being from the West, sausage means pork. So I needed to clarify that it wasn't pork. We were in a Christian country, so I was comfortable with eating the meat as long as it wasn't pork. So I went to clarify, and the pizza guy laughed at me and said, "Brother, don't you realize the entire town is Muslim?" And I was like, "What, in Serbia? Really? Wow!" And then later that evening, you know, in the kind of town square, my daughters noticed a candy floss seller, and so we went and approached him. And being a very well travelled and weathered, almost jaded traveller, I knew the kind of, you know, situation I was in. He was a street trader. There was no prices up, Justin, so I was likely to get ripped off here. But I just needed to make sure I didn't get ripped off too much. So, you know, I was carefully watching the person in front of me and hoping I could see what note they passed, because they were a local. But I missed it. It was too quick. The sleight of hand was too quick. So, you know, once the candy floss had been prepared, I handed over what I considered to be a relatively decent kind of bidding, handed over the note, and the guy refused it. I thought, oh, here we go. You know, how much is this going to cost me? So I doubled the note, and again he refused me, and this time, you know, he smiled, and so, but it wasn't the smile of someone who was about to do you over. So then I tried again, and I tried to put it into his pocket, thinking this is going to cost me more than my dinner, but here we go. And he moved it away, and he said tourist or musafir, one or the other, and it completely broke us. You know, me and my wife both realized what was happening. He considered us to be a guest in his town, and he refused to take payment from us. And this wasn't an exclusive moment. It happened the next day with a coffee seller, and the coffee seller actually cited the fact that he valued my prayers, my dua, as he said in Arabic, more than the money I was giving him, because he wanted to put that into the bank for the hereafter, which is obviously a direct allusion to the idea within Muslim culture that you should always look after the traveller. So that was the key kind of kindness of stranger moment that we had.
And that's so great to hear, because as you said, maybe your mentality with the seller, we always think a little bit negatively that we are going to be ripped off or whatever, but because that's all we hear about through media, etc. But when we actually, the people we're meeting each other, it is that kindness, it is that trust, etc., that we're lucky enough to experience and enjoy. And in terms of the places you went to, other than the people, was there, I know you traveled lots and through 6 different countries and such, but was there anywhere that stood out to you in terms of either geographic beauty, or was there a place, a mosque, a church, or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, there were many, and of course you've read in the book, Justin, that so many places left me, you know, dumbstruck, and you know, I was astonished by the sheer wealth of Muslim heritage, both tangible and intangible, that I was coming upon. And it was largely because I could see what was the Muslim heritage as opposed to what was just, you know, other heritage in these spaces. But yes, there was one place that really does stand out in my mind even now, and this was when we turned up in Tetovo, which is a small town on the western border of North Macedonia, if I remember correctly. And you know, we were seeking out this Sufi lodge that we'd heard about, which was meant to be there, and had this wonderful connection to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and all of these things. And we were really, really hungry, and I think the children wanted burgers, so we were driving around trying to find somewhere to eat before we went and visited the lodge. And as we were nearing where this burger joint was supposed to be in this small town, my wife Tamara noticed this fabulously painted building, which kind of resembled a Tudor building in that it had the timber bits going through and the chalk white panels, but the chalk white panels had been fabulously decorated. There was no kind of obvious indication that it was a mosque, except a minaret towards the back. And eventually, when I managed to get access to this particular mosque, it completely blew me away, because it was one of the finest examples we'd come across of this kind of almost forgotten or certainly neglected European Muslim art style known as the tulip art style, which was a moment in Ottoman heritage and history when they really began to embrace and embrace and bring together classical Baroque Rococo from what we might call the white Western European art style, and marry it with the classical Islamic. And you know, inside this mosque in Tetavo, which is nicknamed the Painted Mosque for obvious reasons, it was just in the most vivid and the most spectacular fashion, where you looked up to the kind of internal dome, and you could have been looking up at a kind of Renaissance dome somewhere in Italy or Spain, maybe.
Excuse my ignorance. You mentioned where it was.
In North Macedonia.
In Kosovo.
Yeah, towards the western border.
North Macedonia. Okay. I haven't yet been there, but we'll definitely do on that recommendation. Go to Tetavo. You mentioned two places that I love, which was Sarajevo and Novi Pazar. I love them. I also really, I thought it was fascinating for a lot of different reasons as Mostar. And you mentioned Suleiman the Magnificent. One of his architects was, well, you know the story better than me, but what did you like?
I mean, Mostar has many things going for it, but of course the iconic bridge is the thing that stands out. It's the thing that attracts the tourists, and there's a number of reasons for it. Of course, most of your listeners today and the people who have tuned in are well traveled and probably know that the bridge we see today isn't the original bridge, in that the original bridge, of course, was sadly destroyed as part of a systematic effort to try and eradicate that Islamic Turkish culture, if you like. And so the bridge becomes important for many, many reasons. For me, one of the reasons was because Evliya Çelebi stood on it and he visited it. And so I had this wonderful glimpse of Evliya Çelebi turning up and watching people dive off the bridge, which is something most people think is some modern phenomenon. And then when you see Evliya Çelebi's eyewitness account of young local boys throwing themselves off it, sometimes hand in hand, doing whirls and twirls, and shouting Ya Allah as they did, you think, oh, okay, this is clearly not a modern incarnation. And they would do it to try and get some money off a visiting pasha or something. So there was that side of it where I was able to obviously look back and forth. And Evliya Çelebi considered it one of the great wonders of the world. And for somebody who's as well traveled as him, you can imagine where we are with that. And it was Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent who commissioned it. And it was actually built by a student of the great Mimar Sinan, who you were alluding to. His name was Mimar Hayruddin. Many people mistakenly think it's Sinan who built it, but it wasn't. But the other interesting thing, of course, about the bridge is that when I was there, I realized that it was also one of the places that many Islamophobic Westerners just simply refused to accept could have been built by this kind of barbaric backwards culture, which is what they considered to be Muslim Turkish culture to be. And in my book, you know, I quote several of those individuals, including a famous English archaeologist who, as late as the kind of latter part of the 19th century, was adamant, absolutely adamant, it had to have been built by a Roman emperor. You know, and then we had, I think it was Charlotte de Lauzane, a French painter, who spoke about it being this kind of Latin marvel in the midst of Turkish barbarity. So for me, you know, those moments, those pieces of literature that I've tried to quote there, they're symptomatic of the kind of conscious and unconscious Islamophobia, sadly, that is in a lot of the Western literature that writes about the Muslim culture across Europe. And this is the challenge that we face if we want to try and normalize Muslim culture as having been a part of the European landscape for as long as we've known Europe. In fact, if we're blunt, Islam was here long before the concept of Europe was.
And again, bringing together cultures, bringing together peoples. You said that Moscow, obviously, the bridge was destroyed in 92, 3, 4, and then it has been rebuilt. And I know your book is about Muslim Europe, but you refer to sort of some of the aggression that took place in the 90s, etc. To what extent do you still see that, or for the benefit of those who've not been there? Do you think that the people have moved on from that, or is it still there in the background?
I think that's a very complex question that I can't fully answer. I can only speak about what I came across. I found people who clearly want to move on. I found people who can see that there are people who don't want to move on, who want to resurrect those tensions at every opportunity. There's an issue with people who deny the genocide that took place. We know this. Every year we're still finding the remains of those who were mass murdered and killed in such a way. We know that there was an awful mass genocide that took place there, the worst since the world wars, and yet consistently you will hear people overlook this and not even mention it, which I find absolutely fascinating. Now, the other thing about that particular genocide, of course, is almost every single person killed was exclusively Muslim. So when people talk about it being an ethnic issue, I think it undermines the fact that actually it was a religious issue as well. There was a massive religious element to it. And I would speak to people whose, forefathers were victims of this, who would say that they believe in the current climate where they see Islamophobia at a heightened level that they've never witnessed in Europe themselves, in their opinions, before. They believe if something like that was to happen now, nobody would stop it, seeing it to its final end. That's how terrified they are. So every time I read about agitation in the area, it does bother me. The scars are very deep. Many of the people who lived through it, were fortunate enough to live through it, are still alive. So it's part of living memory. And then you have the young people, one of whom, of course, is in my book for a whole chapter, where he's taking me around on a wonderful tour and happens to have been descended from a very prolific individual as well. And people like that also talk about the fact that they never lived through it. They never experienced it. They don't know just how dark it was. They cannot know how dark it was. And yet it's a part of who they are, which I think is a very tough place to be as well. And I felt the kind of confusion, the pain and the anguish from that particular individual's soul, because they wanted to, of course, honor that darkness and what had been, but they also wanted to move forward. And that's a very tough place to be if you're born way after the actual crime as well. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute being born afterwards isn't a positive thing, of course, but you understand where I'm coming from, Justin.
Yeah. No, I hear, and it's interesting what you said about that some people still deny it, because one of our guys in Srebrenica was saying exactly that many in Serbia will deny it. And so as a result, my girls were very uncomfortable traveling into Serbia.
No.
And I'd say, well, we can't.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I traveled through Serbia and we had the most wonderful time. We were very well received in Muslim and non-Muslim areas. I wouldn't dare to tarnish an entire people with any crime in that way.
Yeah. And also, I think that what you were saying is language is so important. So when we were in Sarajevo, we had a wonderful lady who was guiding us around. She was a Bosnian Muslim. She was about 16 in 94 at the time of Sarajevo. And she was very particular in the language she was using, sort of not civil war, not war. She was talking about how one-sided it was. And she was talking about aggression, etc. And so I think, as you suggested in your answer at the beginning, it's not an easy question to answer. It is far more complex, and writers must be careful about that, as you are in your book, and not being one-sided or whatever about it. In terms of the book itself, what do you want somebody reading to take out from the book itself? What was your goal in sort of sitting down?
I want them to see how rich and beautiful European Muslim culture is. I want them to accept that there is a Muslim Europe, albeit if they want to consider it to be a tiny part or a big part. I want to normalize the idea that Muslims are a part and parcel of the fabric of Europe. In fact, the more they look into it, the more I'm sure those that are well read will realize that Islam and Muslim culture was a key building cornerstone of modern Europe. You know, and for me, it's to normalize this idea, to point out that there is an entire indigenous community out there still alive. It's not just about, oh yeah, they were historically in places like Spain and we can go and visit the Alhambra and marvel at how beautiful it is, make these wonderful TikToks, but it's okay, they're not here no more. Well, actually they are. They're still here. And some of them look exactly like the Northwestern Europeans. They're blonde-haired and blue-eyed. And you know, this is what, I guess, when I was sitting with the Bosnians, I think they sum it up best, what I really want from this book. And they would say, we just don't understand this whole debate about, you know, can Muslims live in Europe? Can they be European? Why don't they just come and ask us? We've been here for 600 years being Muslim and European. And it's that kind of normalization that I want to begin the process of. I don't pretend for 1 minute that my book could entirely change, you know, centuries of stagnation in this area, you know, but maybe it'll get people to think of their European heritage in different ways. But also, I think one of the most important things I want them to take away from this is how important it is who is telling you the story.
Yeah, I think that's very true. That's very true. That's one of the things I learned doing history. Was like, look at the sources. What is your source, and what's their agenda? What are they trying to say? And as you said, that often the victors will write history as well, Shakespeare and sort of the degradation of sort of dynasty before the Tudors. So, so just on a very different note, traveling with your young girls at the time, how much did it? And you were very worried about the cost of buying sort of candy floss or whatever, but how much did it cost you in ice cream?
You know, that's a given, isn't it? Yeah. You know, we had to find. I think they've tasted every kind of Balkan ice cream there is out there. You know, but yeah, no, they're very good. You know, they're also very kind of open-minded. As a result, you know, they've been privileged to get this kind of education where they were born into a family where mum and dad both loved to travel. We both caught the bug very late. I mean, sorry, not very late. We both caught the bug early, but because we started a family early, it meant we had to make a decision. We either travel with them or we don't travel at all. And we decided to travel with them. And, you know, and whilst it was a steep learning curve, by the time they got to the ages that they were when we were traveling around the Balkans, clearly, you know, we had kind of refined that system, and we knew what to do when. And like you say, ice cream played a big part in pacifying those slightly trickier moments.
But from a travel point of view, from being a travel company and logistical point of view, it is a wonderful destination to travel through as a family. And I think it's come out in our conversation that it's a sense of discovery, a lot of learning, but also a lot of there's a lot of beauty there, a lot of fun. And in the book, you go to Montenegro up in the north. The scenery there is absolutely stunning.
Spectacular. You know, we also actually ended up in places like Kotor Bay, you know, in Montenegro. And I don't think I write too much about that because I'm obviously focusing on the areas where the history and heritage tells a particular aspect of the narrative. But you're right, it's such a spectacular and up until very recently underrated part of Europe. And again, I come back to this. Yes, there's this, you know, through the literature there was this demonization of the Muslim culture, but actually there was just a demonization of Eastern Europe, just generally Eastern Europe. And so, you know, obviously I have my theories about why that took place. And for me personally, it's not because, you know, it was behind the Iron Curtain and under communism and they're slightly different to us. For me personally, it's because it was Muslim for so long. But what then happens is the whole region gets demonized. And if you look at historic literature on the Balkans by the West, whether it's, you know, German writers, French writers, British writers, American writers, whether it was exoticizing or not, there was always this othering. There was always this idea that there's Europe proper, and this idea remains. There's Europe proper, and then there's Eastern Europe. And you and I both know, Justin, the word East carries a whole host of negative and positive connotations, okay? But what it doesn't say is, it doesn't say Europe. It says there's Europe and then there's Eastern Europe. And this is also another reason, in my opinion, why the idea of Muslim Europe is so bizarre to people, because it's in Eastern Europe. So it's not really Europe, is it? That's why people struggle with it. You know, for them, the Europe that they believe to be Europe doesn't have any indigenous Muslim culture. So therefore, there is no Muslim culture in Europe. And this is another reason, like, sorry, coming back to the point we started talking in this moment in time. For me, this is the reason why people have historically not valued the Balkans as a travel destination. This is why people are suddenly going crazy about Albania when it's always been that spectacular and stunning. You know, there is so much in this region that we value and love when we go on holidays, but we just, for whatever reason, well, we've spoken about the reasons why, we've just never considered it to be a place that we want to visit.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and that's why the media politicians have to be so careful about the language that they use and how they use that language. But that's one of the reasons why we travel, for that sense of discovery, to change our prejudice and preconceptions of different places and meet the people. So I'd love to carry on talking. I mean, there's far more we can talk about, and we'll say at the end for listeners to read and buy the book, but or buy and read the book. What else? Are you working on something else at the moment? Is there a sort of a follow-up to it in some way? And if there is, to what extent do your daughters or tomorrow your wife have a say in where they go?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely working on other stuff. I'm working on some Lonely Planet guides right now. I'm going to be working on I'm also doing research for a follow-up where I'm going to be covering a different part of Europe to try and bring this to the fore. The family feature in it, but more in a kind of, possibly in a more retrospective way, because on this particular journey I'm going to be revisiting places, and I'm going to talk about how different they seem from the perspective of being better informed now. Now, the reason I'm better informed is because I've had to go and do the research myself. So I'm going to try and tell that entire story and obviously connect it to the one I've written for Minarets, because to be honest, in Minarets we're really covering, as you pointed out, the Ottoman period, and the Ottomans really become apparent kind of the latter part of the 13th, you know, and really much more apparent in the 14th centuries. There was a whole other Muslim culture going on before that across Europe that most of us know nothing about. I mentioned the Alhambra earlier. That's clearly one of the places that you know, some people are becoming aware of, but actually there are many more spaces across Europe where we have historic ancient Islamic culture that still resonates to this day, still impacts who we are today, that people know very little about. And I'm hoping in my next book I can bring some of that to the surface.
Your publisher hasn't asked me to say this, but when might that be?
We're still a little way away. You know, it'll probably be sometime in 2025 now. Yeah. But I'm working on other stuff that will be coming out in the meantime. But that will be the big project going on in the background, Justin, yes.
You said that you're working on other stuff in the meantime, just to sort of to make sure that tomorrow is all right, that there is some money coming in, that you are doing.
I'm a writer. There's clearly no money coming in, so I have to do other things as well, of course.
Okay, so that's why everybody, you've got to go out and buy this most wonderful book. It's such a key, important book that needs telling, especially with the authority with which Tharik does it. So, Tharik, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us here today, and thank you for writing the book.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here, and I really appreciate how much you engaged with the text, and also, you know, the fact that you wanted me here today. Thank you so much.